Hi, everybody. My name is Jamie McLeod-Skinner, and I'm running to be Oregon's next Secretary of State. Thank you for joining us for another Oregon Voices Roundtable. And our conversation today is going to be on local and regional responses to COVID-19. I'm running for Secretary of State to build a better democracy, to ensure accountable government, safeguard our natural resources, and rebuild our economy after COVID-19. And accountability means accountability to all Oregonians, all the folks who live and work in Oregon. And so we've been using this Oregon Voices Roundtable to really help voices be heard and identify the gaps in where government may not be serving our communities as well, or also to learn about things that we're learning through this process of dealing with the pandemic. So we've got some great guests from across our state, and really excited to introduce and welcome them. But just wanted to start out, first of all, with a land acknowledgement. As we and our guests on this event are streaming from all parts of our state, we'd like to acknowledge that the state of Oregon rests on the traditional homelands of many tribal nations. We thank the descendants of these tribes for being the original stewards and protectors of these lands since time immemorial. We also acknowledge the systematic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Indigenous and Native American families today. And we still see those examples here in Oregon. We are honored by the collective work of many tribal and Native nations, the leaders and families who are demonstrating resilience, resistance, revitalization, healing, and creativity. And we are all honored to be guests upon these lands. So with that, please join me in welcoming our, thank you. Join me in welcoming our great panel of guests. And I'll ask our guests as I introduce them, please give your pronouns, location, and some of the experience that you bring to this conversation. And Misha Belden, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Misha. I use they, them pronouns, and I am in the Portland metro area. I was previously an intern at Metro for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion department, and previously 350 PDX's climate strike organizer. Currently, I work at APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, as the event and welcome desk coordinator, and I'm a community organizer with Gabriella Portland and the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Misha. JR Lilly, please welcome.
Yat JR Lilly Yirishia, Tachi Nidashla, Sanjay Kenneth Bashichi, Tachi Nidasha Chedoa, Tabahan Dashnella. Good afternoon. My name is JR Lilly. I'm part of the Red Rents Water people, born for the Cliff Dwelling people. My mother's father is part of the Red Rents Water people as well. My father's father is part of the Edgewater people, part of the Navajo Nation, and I am part of the urban Native community here in Portland, Oregon, specifically living in East Portland.
Thank you. And I wanted to say we've had this on other roundtables as well. If anyone feels comfortable in speaking in languages other than English, feel welcome to also give your responses in both languages, because that's a great part of the conversation. And then also specifically appreciate your participation in this conversation, JR, because it's my understanding that Portland has one of the largest gatherings and population of tribal communities in urban areas in the nation. So thank you very much for your participating in our conversation today. Melanie Kebler from Central Oregon. Melanie.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everybody. My name is Melanie Kebler. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an attorney here in Bend, and I represent crime victims in criminal cases and in protective order cases. I'm also the president of the board of Campfire Central Oregon, which is a youth enrichment nonprofit that's near and dear to my heart because I was a campfire kid from grade 1 through high school. And I grew up in Bend, and I'm also running for Bend City Council.
Great, thank you. Anthony Broadman.
Hi, Jamie. Anthony Broadman. I use he, him. I'm a lawyer in Bend, Oregon, and I represent primarily tribal governments and small businesses in Bend. And I'm also running for a different position than Melanie on the Bend City Council in November. So thanks so much for having me.
Great, thanks for being part of it. Lizzie Caston.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Caston. I'm an economic development and community development specialist. I'm a consultant. I am in the Portland area. I use she, her. I have worked in post-disaster recovery efforts for economic and community development in places like rural Louisiana after Katrina and in the Rust Belt after our last recession. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I work I'm doing work right now for Alberta Main Street. I've done some work for Business for a Better Portland during COVID. And I also do policy on the national and wider scale level.
Great, and really looking forward to some of your specific comments and reflections on disaster relief, especially with regard to this conversation of COVID-19, because it's like we're in a slow motion disaster. Usually there's these intense events that are responses to, but we're seeing this in a slow motion type impact. And so, yeah. And Nik Heuertz, welcome.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Nik Heuertz, and I use he, him, and I grew up in Southern Oregon on a small farm. And since then, last 20 years, I've owned operated small businesses in Jackson and Josephine County, and currently running for U.S. House Seat District 2.
One that I'm very familiar with, and also a fellow Southern Oregonian. So my name is Jamie McLeod-Skinner, she, her, my pronouns. My wife and I live in Central Oregon, although I graduated from Ashland High School in Southern Oregon. I'm a natural resource attorney, also serve on the Jefferson County Education Service District Board, and serve all Oregonians in my capacity on the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. The governor appointed me to OWEB. I have my backgrounds in civil engineering, regional planning, and law. I studied law at the U of O, studying natural resource, water, and Indian law. Began my public service managing the reconstruction of schools and hospitals in post-war Bosnia and Kosovo. So also that experience of seeing disaster relief and emergency relief and recovery. When I returned to the US, the humanitarian organization I was working for asked me to run their refugee resettlement office in San Jose in the South Bay. So also again, work with families and communities who are grappling with readjusting their lives to a new reality. So I've served underrepresented and diverse communities for many years in government and in the nonprofit sector, including voting and helping people get access to their right to vote, working in partnership with community-based organizations. Got executive management experience in organizational development and in those two sectors, including work with audits. 9 years of elected office experience in urban and rural areas. And I'm running for this role, like I said, to protect our democracy and really focus on that accountability piece, which is so key. So the roundtable format that we'll have is our wonderful panel will discuss the topic. And then if we have time, we'll also answer questions. So if you have any questions, you're listening in, go ahead and write them in the comments line and we'll try to get to those if we have time. And I want to start out by saying a little bit about the Secretary of State role and really explaining why this conversation is relevant to that role. So the Secretary of State's job is to ensure that all voices are heard and that government is accountable to all Oregonians. It's an executive management role that oversees 220 staff and several important divisions: elections, audits, corporations, that's registration of businesses, and our state archives, which has to do with transparency. It also serves as a member of the State Land Board, the State Board of Education, and also is essentially backup governor. We don't have a lieutenant governor, but is essentially de facto lieutenant governor, and is the backstop for redistricting if our legislature walks out again and is unable to complete that task. So the key thing here is having conversation, understanding the challenges that our communities are facing on that accountable government piece, because the Secretary of State's role is really to daylight and call out and identify those areas where we can do better. So our conversation today, and where Oregon is today with regard to COVID-19, it's having, of course, a tremendous impact on our communities and our economy. Everything from health impacts, economic impacts, spikes in hate crimes. As I heard someone say, 7 weeks and 100 years ago, it seems, when this first started, Governor Brown gave us a stay-at-home, save lives order. And just yesterday, she announced a process for the counties reopening if they met certain criteria. And I think we've got up to 31 counties who are in the process of doing that. And so we're starting to see this gradual reopening, but of course we still need to stay safe. We've seen other states jump ahead too soon and have spikes in people reinfecting or getting COVID. So we want to just be very careful. But for today, we want to ask two essential questions of everyone from their different perspectives. And the first has to do with the kind of here and now where we're at, how communities are being impacted by the pandemic. And then the second question is really going to be looking forward. What's the path to building healthier and more resilient communities? So let's start with that first question. And Misha, if we can start with you, what's the impact of COVID-19 that you're seeing in the community where you're living, what steps are being taken for crisis response, and what are we either seeing or what do we need to be seeing in the experience of Oregonians impacted by COVID-19?
Thank you, Jamie. So the impact of COVID-19 in the community is, I do work for the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, which is housed in the Jade District off of 82nd in Portland. And there you see a really large population of Asian Pacific Islander groups living there. And a lot of the impact that we are seeing is a lot of xenophobia and xenophobia and hate crimes in our area, whether it be tagging on local businesses or just general slander. And so there is this like huge impact of racism in our community right now because of COVID-19. And in terms of economic impacts, we are seeing that Asian Pacific Islander or owned businesses are being hit really, really hard. And it's been hit hard since February before COVID-19 made its way to the United States. And a lot of the work that people are seeing right now, at least with APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, is we are trying to address narrative shifts around racism and xenophobia in our community right now. And we're doing that through this lens of Courage During COVID. It's this project that numerous people are working on to show the leadership in our community, particularly women leadership in our community, that is helping impact our community, whether it be work around data analysis around COVID-19 or leadership around creative arts. And we're also trying to instill hope and inspiration in people by showing these like courageous stories of our community right now, whether it be they're facing all of these like racist remarks, or they are being impacted deeply by the economic crisis that we're facing. And other things that we are doing, that APANO has been doing, is we have been disseminating small business grants to API, Asian Pacific Islander owned businesses, to help try to save this like really big cultural point in our community. Jade District is really, really known for all of these like small businesses. And, around that as well is that there are other organizations that I'm working with, such as the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns, NAFCON, where many people are either healthcare workers or unemployed because of COVID. And so there's this thing called the Bayanihan Campaign, which Bayanihan means kind of like home gift in a way. And we've been showing like appreciation to our nurse community, because Filipinos have a really big nurse community, and there's like a long historical thing behind that I will not address right now. But outside of that too, is that in the Pacific Islander community, there is a huge health disparity right now. In Portland in particular, about 0.5% of our population are Pacific Islander, and yet they make up 5.6% of all COVID cases in Multnomah County, which is a huge, huge health disparity. And these things aren't being reflected in our data, and that particular community, the Pacific Islander community, is not being reached out to enough by the local government. And so we need to see a lot more resources be disseminated back to our Pacific Islander community, as well as just like a simple recognition. And then on top of that, just to like lead this off, is other resources we need right now is like really a narrative shift around racism and COVID-19, and that's not being addressed nearly as enough as I think it could be. It's something you see a lot on the internet in certain circles. However, in terms of the leadership that I have seen, statewide, it's not as addressed as I would like it to be, and our communities would like it to be.
Well, thank you so much for pointing that out. And it seems twofold here. We have a painful history of racism here in Oregon, but also on top of that, we have what the president is now saying in targeting of the Asian American community and the references association. So the specific targeting you're talking about is tied in, and it's quite horrifying and shameful to say, but it's being promoted by our president. And so specific targeting to the Asian American community. Thanks for pointing some of those things out, and especially that data piece of collecting data and then being able to look at those disparities. That's why I'll talk later about audits and equity audits, but that's the kind of thing we can be calling out, really noting where the resources are going or not going, and disparities in terms of impacts, especially on health impacts. Thank you for that. JR, can you share some of your thoughts on this issue of where are we at now? What either steps are taking, or what are we seeing, or what needs to be seen in the experience of Oregonians impacted by COVID-19?
Thank you. Yes, certainly can speak to that in a lot of levels within the Native American community. The thing about it is that our community was already impacted before COVID-19. Issues of poverty, number of kids in our foster care system, the missing murdered Indigenous women movement speaks to a lot of those areas that have already been impacted. So COVID-19, when the pandemic hit, it just amplifies all of those issues just even more so. Particularly some issues that I will speak to involve around not able to have our ceremonies. We're not able to gather together. A lot of the powwows have been canceled, and as community people, as social people, our values are there. So that's definitely impacted us, as well as a lot of our elders are our story keepers in our sacred ceremony. They carry those songs with them. So since they're more at risk, much more than just the individual, but those stories within our culture are at risk. We're very scared of losing a lot of our elders. They say when an elder dies, the library burns to the ground because of all our oral traditions and our stories. So how do we continue to protect them? How do we keep them out of harm's way? And what are we doing? So as a community, we're definitely coming together. There's been some great stories of families coming together and supporting, looking after their elders and bringing them food and helping them connect with resources, as well as trying to connect them online. But as well as the economic impact, poverty, and some of those things are also amplified at this time. I'll speak specifically to East Portland because if you take a look at the demographics, East Portland has 50% of the families that live below the poverty level. We have 1 in 3 youth that under 19 years old live in East Portland. And we have 2 out of 5 foreign-born folks live in East Portland. So a lot of the impact we're feeling with Native Americans as well as everyone else in East Portland, we're feeling the impact more. But when the state looks at it, they look at Multnomah County. And if you divide it down by 82nd Avenue, those who live west are not as impacted as those feeling east. If you were just to isolate East County on its own, and compare that, we would be one of the most impacted communities in all of the Oregon. But it's not seen that way. So how we look at the data and how we distribute resources and communicate the need needs to be understood a little bit more. And what we need to do to take care of our elders and our ceremonies, we're definitely feeling that. There's a lot of good initiatives that are going on. Schools are being very helpful, but the shining star, I would say, is just a lot of the families coming together and looking after each other and taking care of our elders.
Well, thank you so much for that. And some of those real key points, like everything from just that data piece of looking at how things are different within Multnomah County. I actually had a roundtable just recently with folks who from East County, and they were talking about some of those discrepancies. And I think that's that understanding of people's experience is something that it's part of the data and part of the analysis of the data. It's so key, but also greater levels of vulnerability. And I've been in many of the forums, I've been talking about this. There's a study that's done called Unnatural Causes. I'm just going to hold up the video so people can see. And it actually talks about the health impacts of racism on our bodies. And I think for both for Misha and JR, and specifically talks about some of the impacts of systemic racism here in the United States on communities of color, especially, and how people then our bodies just become more vulnerable when we're experiencing that constant barrage. and how, when we've seen this with COVID-19 across our country, how especially communities of color are more vulnerable and more susceptible to the impacts of this pandemic. The other thing, and I appreciate the comments, JR, about access online, and we were all, even this conversation right now is online, but access is a problem. So I'm I serve on the Jefferson County Education Service District Board, and in Jefferson County, about a third of our kids that I serve are tribal kids on the Warm Spring, they're associated with Warm Springs primarily. And on the Warm Springs Reservation, there's areas where there's simply not internet access. So to your point of families trying to stay connected and hearing that critically important piece of oral traditions and that level of contact and sharing that with kids, some families don't even have access to it, which really then again underscores some of the challenges. And then we just had something well, this is going back to Easter, where some folks were going to a salmon feed to practice cultural practices, came back and there was an outbreak of COVID on the Warm Springs Reservation right after that. So that vulnerability to continuing traditions and keeping contact with families in ways that we know that are true to us in our experience makes some folks, some Oregonians, more vulnerable, and folks in our sovereign nations as well. Thank you so much for that. Lizzie, can you share it with us as well and bring the perspective you're seeing through the lens of your experience in working in emergency relief situations? What are we seeing, or what do we need to be seeing in the experience that Oregonians are having right now that are impacted by COVID-19?
Well, I come at it from a very deep economic development and community development perspective, meaning I look at everything from small businesses to housing to job creation to stability, and definitely through an equity lens. But we also know that there are documented patterned phases of disasters. This has been proven over and over again. This one's a little weird, as we said, because we're both in the disaster and it's morphing and it isn't over yet. It's not like a hurricane or a tornado that it's done and then we deal with it. But we do know that there's phases, right? And right now we're still in what they call the triage phase. So we're reacting and it's changing on a daily basis. And we're finding both sides of the coin. One, strong community is rising up to support each other. And then we're also seeing things that were weak and fractured, like racism and issues in communities of poverty and inequities. Those also become amplified. So right now, everything that you experience on a daily basis follows a pattern of disasters that have happened all over the world. People that have had less and that are vulnerable before disasters become even more vulnerable and have less after disasters. Some people make a lot of money during disasters and it's actually beneficial for them. This is true around the state. This is true on micro levels, such as neighborhoods. And it's true, and I think that issue of counties and looking at data and trying to assess it, not just from a quantitative standpoint, but a qualitative standpoint, just to make sure that no one gets left out. Homelessness, huge issue. Like I said, racism, making sure that we are looking at this holistically. And during disasters, the people that have the resources and always get the attention tend to get the more resources and all the attention. So I believe it's up to community organizers, it's up to folks like us to help guide and make sure that if you're on a meeting and somebody mentions something, you always say, but what about the really small businesses, the micro businesses? What about this community? Just to always make sure it's being talked about and that it's at the forefront and that we're all good allies for everyone, not just our own communities. So that's what we're seeing right now. Then we have this kind of heroic phase where everyone's getting together, helping out. And then there's this phase, and I want to be really clear, and I don't want to take up much time with it, but we're entering it, and I think you're starting to see it more and more. It's called the Phase of Disillusionment. And it is where people start to get frustrated because the resources aren't coming. They think it's going to be over. They've been promised things. I think the SBA loan issue is a huge one where we saw a lot of the money go to big companies and the little Companies never got it. People don't know how they're getting their unemployment. Government is slow to respond. And that's when anger starts to rise up and we start to see more vandalism and hate crimes. That's the downside of it. And then we have the rebuilding phase afterwards and the resiliency phase. And this is where it can go really well, or it can slip even worse than what it was before. So we actually have an opportunity as Oregonians to make our communities better than they were before COVID by addressing issues that we have not addressed and really answering those hard questions and making sure people that are vulnerable and have been marginalized and historically treated very poorly by our state are treated better moving forward. So that's what I meant.
Thank you so much for walking us through that sense of phases, because yeah, I think people are experiencing that, and to your point, we know what to expect. It's like the stages of grief. We kind of know what to expect, and when we're in it, in the midst of it, we're feeling it. But laying that out is really key. And to your point of the opportunity we have. I mean, this is a very difficult time, but the opportunity to build a better Oregon is really the basis for these conversations. This is what I'm trying to get to. Is there are things that we always knew that were there before, but now that everyone's going through a more difficult time, hopefully it raises that level of empathy and awareness that other people have had very difficult times before, and that's something that we need to change going forward. But setting the stage now and having the conversations now and listening to the voices we need to listen to now to make sure we're learning what we need to do to prepare us for that positive model going forward, that more resilient model you mentioned, and not the negative alternative, and to be aware and conscious of the outbreaks of hate and some of the negative things that are happening now, to be more responsive in real time to them. Thank you for that. Anthony, your thoughts on what do we need to be seeing? What are you seeing? What are some of those experiences of Oregonians who are impacted by COVID-19?
Well, thanks, Jamie. This has been really educational so far. So thanks for bringing us all together. I love the opportunity to learn. In Bend, we're seeing, the significant unemployment and problems and business interruption that I think a lot of communities are seeing. We're going to continue to suffer for the indefinite future. That brings all of the problems that we know: vulnerable populations of color, houseless populations, working parents, people who were pretty much struggling before COVID, really bear the brunt of. We're one of the hardest hit regions for layoffs and cities, because we not only have the high concentration of travel and tourism, but we're a regional health hub, and healthcare has taken a huge hit since the middle of March. So when you look at a sector like construction, more than 16% of folks in the Central Oregon construction industry made their first claim for unemployment in the last 7 weeks. So these are huge numbers, and the curves that will sort of model our recovery are daunting. The good news is healthcare is pretty resilient. The bad news is that we have no idea for Bend what is going to be made of the travel tourism sector, in the coming months and years. So it really falls on us as a community, as a government, a city government, to put our small businesses and our workers in a position to succeed, even in these really challenging times, safely. And I don't think we can minimize the public safety backdrop to all of this. None of this makes sense if we're ill and if our vulnerable populations are ill. So one thing we've been working on here in Bend is trying to have the city partner with our amazing restaurants, our amazing retail downtown, to open streets for walking, for open air dining options, so that when places are able to open, they're able to honor the state's distancing regulations. They can do so safely in a way that gets people back to work. Patrons can come down safely. Workers can be safe. So when it's safe, streets are actually people focused in a way that actually helps businesses, and businesses can recognize. As I said at the outset, I represent tribal governments primarily, and about 15 years ago, 13 years ago, one of my first tribal clients told me, "Don't tell me what is not possible." And I kind of think of that every day. Don't tell me what is not possible. Tell me what I can do. So I think city government can be a partner to businesses. I think we can have people focused neighborhoods and business districts after Corona. We can use this as an opportunity to develop the things we all know we want out of a community, out of a city, one that treats everybody equitably and one that is healthy for everybody who lives in it. And downtown is a perfect microcosm of this. It's our biggest employer. There's 4,000, or one of our biggest employers, with about 4,000 people if you took them all together. So when you go downtown, it's like a big industry. And these are jobs that support a huge spectrum of our Latinx community, our working class families, our young people. We need to ensure that it's safe so that when we do reopen, these folks can get back to work, support their families. And I hope opening streets to people downtown is a big part of that. So I think we really need our government to partner with our workers, partner with our small businesses, make sure, in the first instance that we're treating this recovery more as a low pressure faucet than a ratchet, and be really careful. So thanks.
Well, thanks for that. And it really, I love your emphasis on partnerships, because in so many things, working with partners and working with community-based organizations as well, to really understand some of those different impacts. I mean, for your comments, and also for Melanie and Nik as well, for government, local or state or federal, there's always limited resources. So how to best spend those resources, leverage them in a way you can get the best bang for your buck. That's why I always make the equity argument, because if you're really having that ability to maximize those resources in terms of what you're able to impact. And then also just, you mentioned so many sectors, and in Oregon, it's our small businesses employ, in the private sector, employ more than half of our employees. So it's so critical for our economy statewide. But the other really key thing, and this has come up in other roundtables, is the fact that, we were talking about, I mentioned the stay home, stay safe order earlier. And, I had a colleague who was just laughing at saying it's not an option for so many folks. If you're in the service industry, if you're a farm worker, if you're in some of these industries, or if you're in healthcare as well, where it's simply not an option. It disproportionately impacts our poorer communities who are in some of those doing some of that work. So developing those partnerships and seeing those Oregonians is such a critical part of moving forward through this time. Melanie, other thoughts? Again, you're also looking at city council in Bend, and also you're building you work with community-based organizations. What are some of those things that we're not seeing or should be seeing in this time?
Well, I think I'll talk a little bit about the impacts that I've seen just through my work. First off, just working with crime victims, primarily victims of domestic violence or sexual violence. And again, as folks have touched on, folks that are already vulnerable when this happened, that sort of ratcheted up the seriousness and the impact on them. So we're seeing issues with people accessing services or wanting to reach out when they're in trouble and unsafe, full shelters, because we don't have a lot of affordable housing options and other emergency shelter slots for folks to go. And, just increasing calls to our local police who have to deal with that, along with everything else that's going on. So that's one impact we've seen. I've seen our local domestic violence agency sort of try to pivot into technology and text access and other ways for folks to access them. And I've seen, the community just coming together in general, as was mentioned before, to help people that are in vulnerable situations that need emergency assistance. And our courts as well have responded in a way that protects folks who need emergency legal protection, but also keeps people safe when they come in the courthouse and minimizes the exposure folks have and when they're in there to seek legal services. Another area that's huge is childcare. Central Oregon is already a childcare desert. Childcares are primarily small businesses. They're going to be suffering just like other small businesses, and having to limit how many kids can be there. Some of them even just shutting down. And I am, at our last city council meeting, the council opted to spend a little bit of the budget and put a little bit of cash infusion to help some of those small childcare businesses. I think we're going to need a lot more of that to encourage them to stay open and to expand when necessary. And when people are going back to work, they need somewhere for their kids to go. And so I think access to affordable childcare continues to be an issue and is something that needs to be addressed. I have watched the city try to respond kind of on a micro local level with things like relaxing code enforcement downtown so folks can drive up and do takeout in places they normally might not be able to help those businesses stay alive. a program for utility relief for commercial businesses that allows them to get up to $500, forgiven or not charged them on their utility bill to try to help that expense. It's small things, and I think that's what you're going to see from a local city government where we're looking down the barrel of a real revenue shortfall because of this. So they're doing what they can. I would like to see those programs continue and expand as much as possible. One shortfall, I think, is, I asked for the stats on the utility program to find out how many businesses are accessing it, and saw that they have 48 applications. A good thing is about 50% of those were businesses that self-identified as women, minority-owned, or veteran-owned. But unfortunately, there were 0 Spanish language applications. And I think right now, as everyone's talking about, local governments really need to be doing outreach to those communities and making sure not just that they're offering resources, but people know that those resources are available and feel comfortable accessing those resources from their local government. And that kind of goes back to that trust and accountability factor. So I think, we're just going to have to continue to work locally as best we can. I will give a plug that I think we need more federal funding to flow to local governments, to tribes, and to states. And I hope to see that in the future. But it's going to be some tough times, and Bend is doing the best that it can for now with some of these local programs. And I, like Anthony said, I support also the city partnering with as many local organizations, businesses, other government entities as possible to facilitate some of these programs that will help businesses open safely, that will support our most vulnerable community members at the same time.
Well, thanks so much for that. Again, talking about the partnership models and the recognition of, look, sometimes we have to reach out to connect with, so it's not just making things available, it's making sure folks know about it. But the other things, of course, is then those community-based organizations that are sometimes cobbled together as just volunteers to make sure they have the resources they need to be able to provide some of those services back and be part of that key that key link in the chain to good governance. When I worked previously with many different community-based organizations, I actually set up a capacity building program, and it was to help community-based organizations that were providing that critical link between government and communities, but making sure that they had the resources and the training so that they could pass audits and get grants and get the resources so they could actually provide things. Because the other thing I've heard sometimes from community-based organizations is, okay, we love partnerships. Finally, you're talking about partnerships, but now you're expecting us to do all this work and we're driven by volunteers. And so we need resources too, because we can only do so much. So that thinking, I think, needs to be part of the conversation. But then you also raise the thing about needing more federal resources. So that wraps up this first question really well. Going to you, Nik. What are some of the things you're seeing, and especially actually in rural Southern Oregon? Are there different things that you're seeing impacting Oregonians that we've not heard? And then also, what are some of the ideas on your ideas on ways that the federal government can be more interactive and more reactive as well?
Absolutely. Thank you. So I think, financially, as a small business owner, someone who's worked in retail before that and also grew up on a small farm, I just see a lot of people falling through the cracks financially. We haven't had a lot of national leadership, and the funds that have been made available haven't necessarily been the right choices or smart choices. So when a small business category, one of the things on my platform is to make a new category for small businesses, for what I call truly small businesses. Right now, the money went to anybody under 500 employees. So I think it needs to be a little more means tested based on profit dollars and so forth, so that people who really need it, small business owners who it's a difference between putting food on the table, a roof over their head, not a difference between expanding this or that, or buying an extra boat. So I think that's what we need to do on the next bill, is we need to make sure that the money is going to the truly small businesses and have it be more needs-based and a quick, easy process as much as possible. On the individual level, seeing a similar thing, they got the unemployment coverage where you get an extra $2,400 a month for unemployment, but a lot of folks are uncertain and worried if they're going to apply for that, if they're going to be approved, how long will it take? And it's I 100% support our social distancing and what we have to do to stay healthy as a nation that way. But I also see that it's not fair to ask people who aren't sure if they're going to be able to pay their rent and put food on the table with a question mark of maybe being able to get unemployment that's backed up. So I think what I've been calling for from the beginning, and again, I think we need in the next bill is what some Democrats are asking for, which is a $2,000 a month payment, needs-based, probably somewhere under $100,000 an individual yearly income needs to get $2,000, and that would help people who maybe aren't applicable for unemployment, but it would also help essential workers who need hazard pay. You know, they're going to work to keep the economy going and to keep us all fed, and they're basically going into a hazardous situation. It would help, you know, homeless. It would help just all the people who are falling through the cracks. So on the national level, I think definitely every piece of legislation I would look at, I would think with an equity lens, but also I think just a basic payment to anybody under a certain income can add some stability to our economy. And we were talking about how racism affects people's health, which is absolutely true. Also, being uncertain about your financial situation affects people's health. So it's not just about economics, but it's also about staying healthy. And I think just a payment to everybody, even the current administration acknowledges, even though they're going back and forth on social distancing, even they acknowledge we're in a national emergency. So through a national emergency, I think that's what government's for. And we should be doing a monthly recurring payment so people are secure and healthy.
Can we add healthcare in there too?
Yeah, I was just going to say.
So I mean, what we're asking.
So,
yeah, that was going to be my second answer.
Well, and I think to that point, I mean, there's a couple of things. One, isn't it striking that things that people said 6 months ago, it wasn't even part of the conversation, it was being blown off, is now something that's actually happening. So there's been that change in this new reality that we're in. And then also, yeah, your comment about quote unquote small businesses and just the sheer outrage I think so many people felt with the thinking, okay, great, some support to small businesses. Everyone, you know, understands that it's part of our economic engine is developing our small businesses and supporting our small businesses. And then when the definition came out, it's like, on what planet is that a small business? But anyway,
Absolutely.
So that, I mean, that oversight is really key. One of the other things that just strikes me in terms of my own experience looking back, and I mentioned I've worked in war-torn countries, I've worked with refugees. It's now, we're almost seeing this sense of domestic refugees with houselessness and the challenges that folks are facing. It's this whole other level. It ties in, Lizzie, to what you were saying about just these natural disasters. We're seeing it in our everyday lives. And I think one of the things that's so striking for so many is that they've never seen it or experienced it before. Now, we also have communities, obviously, who have experienced it and are seeing it and just have not been seen, and it hasn't been understood by others within our communities. And so again, this is, while it's a painful time to go through, it's also really an opportunity to be thinking about the future and thinking about how we can set the stage to build healthier and more resilient communities, and communities that address these issues. Now that we know, and again, we knew some of this stuff before, but now that we really know, what are we going to do about it? Because that then becomes a responsibility of anyone in government. Absolutely. So looking forward, what are we learning now, or what should we be learning? What have we learned? What will we do differently to build more resilient or sustainable communities? And maybe it's even just this simple question. If you had a magic wand, how would you rebuild Oregon? How would it look different? And so let's start actually with some of the folks talking about government. So Melanie, Anthony, Nik, we'll start with you. Melanie, if you could kick us off in how you would, if you had a magic wand, how would you rebuild Oregon, given what we've seen and what we've learned during this time?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, one thing that I'm taking away and friends and family are talking about is, if our, medically driven and scientific response to this pandemic, which involves safe distancing and shutting down things, if that causes this amount of disparate economic impact that is so serious and so impactful to so many people in our community, we need to look at the underlying economic systems and see what can we do differently and where do we need to change things. And so I think this is an opportunity to think about systemic change on a big level. And that includes, things like housing and healthcare. Like, should housing be, a thing that people invest in and make money off of, or is housing and shelter a right? And do we need to rethink how we look at those parts of our society and really think about what can we do differently coming out of this to build that resiliency just on a wide systemic level? And I think also we're seeing that when motivated, the community can rise up, and hopefully local governments and state governments and tribal governments can rise up and help people, and we can solve problems. We can solve problems quickly. We've had lots of, little projects happening in Bend where, our breweries and distilleries pivoted to sanitizer quite quickly to help people, to distribute that among our community. Neighborhoods and communities just creating a nonprofit on Facebook out of thin air, the Pandemic Partners, which people may have heard of, that has just connecting people in a way that I haven't really seen Facebook really do before. So I think
also
we have
SOS Bend.
Yes, and SOS Bend to help businesses as well, which I know you had Matt on the other day. So I think when we're thinking forward, I don't want us to be like, well, what can we do differently to respond to a pandemic, but what can we do to build that resiliency so if we have to respond to another disaster, we're not going to see this kind of disparate impact on everybody. So I think that's the overarching thing that I'm feeling coming out of this.
Great, thank you. And just to say, we've got some questions rolling in, so let's but we want to answer this question. If you had a magic wand, Anthony, going to you next, how would you rebuild Oregon?
First off, I would absolutely vote for Melanie. That's the first step. I think, I hope that one of the takeaways from this national disaster is a realization that we need to trust science and that we need good government, people who actually believe in the purpose of government, to protect the most vulnerable members of our community when we struggle. I'm not speaking for any of my clients in particular. These are just my own words. I'm not speaking for a tribal government. But looking forward, and this magic wand answer, I'm hoping I hear some more optimism. I know that I will in a second from other more optimistic people. But it's really hard to look forward because we're squarely in the middle of this for very vulnerable populations within the jurisdictions of federally recognized Indian tribes. We need better relationships between state, city, county, and tribal governments. We are in a pretty good position here in Oregon, but you don't have to look very far at what the Oglala Lakota Sioux Nation, the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation are facing with the governor of South Dakota right now, to take a really, really hard look at that relationship. So we need, if people don't know, the governor, of South Dakota told those nations, those sovereign nations, to take down their roadblocks, which were put up to protect vulnerable tribal populations within the reservation. We need leaders like we have in Oregon everywhere. We need leaders like you, Jamie, who understand sovereignty, who understand a government-to-government relationship between our First Nations and the federal government. It's the supreme law of the land under the federal Constitution. So that's part of my magic wand. And I think, look, and then I'm going to just be eminently practical, because right now all we have is the CARES Act. And it's not enough. It doesn't support cities under 500,000 people yet. There are far too many restrictions for tribes, states, tribes and cities and counties as pass-throughs from state fundings. There's far too many strings attached to actually help people. What's troubling is that the PPP came out with comparably pretty few strings. And so, what is available to tribal governments and only 3 local governments within the state of Oregon is, for me, again, very personally, has proven unworkable. There's too many limitations on how that money can be spent. So I would like to see, my magic wand would be that Nik would go and get the HEROES Act passed, which is, sort of a flag plant by Democratic leadership in Congress, and get a new federal package that has fewer strings attached so that cities and tribes and counties and states can do what we need to do to get the funding into the most vulnerable areas of our community. I think things like childcare, the restrictions on the CVF portion of the CARES Act, we could pay for COVID workers childcare under even the most strict reading of the restrictions under the CARES Act. But that money has been so slow to get from the federal government to the state. Oregon got $1.65 billion. The state's doing an admirable job of trying to get that out, but it hasn't been fast enough. So those pass-through dollars need to get down to communities that really need them. So that's my magic wand, I guess, would be speed up the clock.
Yeah, well, and Nik, we'll go to you on that. And actually, yeah, I've got another thing I want to add to your to-do list in addition to Lizzie's on healthcare. I agree with that. And there's also legislation that's hasn't moved forward from the House of Reps yet around also helping tribal communities with better outreach around elections. So I'll put that in your hopper as well. But
Okay.
specific to this magic wand looking forward, I mean, what are some of the how would you rebuild Oregon? What are some of the things that you would like to see us have? And recognizing, of course, that we both want to be visionary and big picture, but also recognizing there are ultimately limited resources. So what are some of those key things we need to focus on?
Yeah, so I'm a big picture person. I think that I think one thing that this this pandemic has shown us is that, a lot of people are eager to get back to normal, but more people don't want to go back to normal. Normal isn't good enough. We can't just go back to normal. So we need big systemic change. And, I could speak on my magic wand for a long time, but I think, just nationally, we need to get our pandemic unit back for sure. Not having one is crazy. But Medicare for All, again, it just, the whole pandemic outlines, illustrates the need for Medicare for All, that, it's not only just for individual health, but for the health of our whole country. We really need that people to be able to feel like they can go to the doctor without worrying about if they're going to be able to afford it or not is huge during a pandemic, of course. So Medicare for All that we talked about, and again, I could go into a lot of details, but big picture wise, I think the Green New Deal does outline a lot of what we need to do in investing, what I call investing in our people and our planet. Building from the ground up. We can do big things as a state, as a city, as a county, country. We can do big things, and I think the Green New Deal really outlines that. I would also incorporate principles of just transition into that. I think some of them are there, but those are two documents that if people want to see my vision of a magic wand, the Green New Deal with just transition sprinkled in is a real good outline for us to move forward in a country that has economic justice and social justice at the same time.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm going to do, because we're starting to get tight on time, so I'm going to incorporate in one of the questions to some of the folks on the last few, and then I'll turn over to you, Misha, then Lizzie, and then Jer. I'll ask you to wrap it up. And so it is this magic wand question, but another question that's come in is, most indicators are blind to the unequal effects of this pandemic and don't show the disproportionate effects on people of color. What can local state officials do to best support them? And so this is part of that magic wand and thinking forward. And I know, Misha, you've been talking about some of these issues as well. So if you incorporate that into your response, but so what's your magic wand for building a better Oregon?
Yes, thank you, Jamie. That question has a lot to do with my answer. Is that
yeah, that's what I figured.
yeah, is that I think that one of the biggest things that I'm seeing and that I think that we really need is like better data practices right now, especially around analyzing the data. Again, like I want to echo, and especially like after what I had said about like our Pacific Island unfortunately affected, is that again, this isn't something that's seen clearly in our data right now. There's not enough like diversity, equity, and inclusion like analysis on these, especially for, again, our Pacific Islander community, our Black, Indigenous, people of color community, our immigrant community. And so like something I would want to see is like better audits. And I'm sure that you have a lot to say on that, so I can pass that off to you.
Well, I'll just say that thank you for that prompting that. But that's, I think, one of the things that the Secretary of State's office can really do is focus on the equity component to audits and really bring that, incorporate it on a certain degree in all audits that we do, but really have some targeted audits that drill down and get to the details of what's going on. And we're seeing some of the stuff, we know in our gut, we're seeing the impacts of it. But to partner and really on audits, one of the key things is what questions do you ask? And so making sure we're asking the right questions, and then it's the professionals who go in and ask those questions and do that analysis and assessment. So that is fair and arm's length and a fair process. but it seems so often we're not asking the questions, or we're not asking the right questions. And so that's some of the things that I think we need to be doing to touch on the things that you mentioned now, and that so many others have talked about during this conversation. And that's something I really want to do. Lizzie, let's go to you next. What are, from the perspective you have and the insights you've seen, and you talked us through what this process generally looks like, where we're at in it, what's your magic wand for a better Oregon moving forward?
I'm going to bring it down to the state level, and I'm going to say, I do not understand how we are coming off one of the most robust economic boom times in Oregon over the past 10 years, and our state says they don't have enough money to respond to COVID. I'm not blaming public officials, but this was our litmus test and our test run as communities for a disaster and as a state, and we did not respond quickly. So the first one is, we have got to get our fiscal and financial base in place in Oregon. To not have money like during a disaster, for it to take as long as it have, when states like Pennsylvania that got hit hard during the recession could come up with $61 million like this through a special session to come down to communities and to really poor communities that need it the most. And we waited and waited and waited and could barely scrape together 10 million for our small businesses, is a red flag that we have got major problems. And we've known this for years, but we have got to get our baseline state financial structure together. Two, our state must learn to act faster and quicker during disasters. And that's as simple as changing rules so that we can call more than one emergency legislative session during an emergency. And the third is, we must fold equity and inclusion into this. Otherwise, it won't work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. And that sense of, again, this is audit is daylighting. The resources, that's the legislature, and we need that leadership in the legislature, and also the not walking out, not the shouting matches, but actually coming together to get things done, which has been so frustrating, I think, for so many of us to see. And my role as Secretary of State would be to conduct the audits, to ask the questions, and to daylight information and present it, and present recommendations on how we can move forward. And you know, I'm sure, Lizzie, you've had the same training I have on the NIM system, the National Incident Management System. So that's, and we're trained on the work I've done before in both my elected and my city roles. You're trained in the system so that when a disaster of any magnitude strikes, you have a system in place to immediately respond, to know people's roles, to those partnerships kick in, and you can scale it. It's scalable at the local level, if it's something a statewide or national or even international, like the pandemic we're facing. So I just know that right away, one of my recommendations would be to have the training. And the government agencies I was a part of before, we had that training, we drilled in that. So if it came up, and it can be everything from an explosion, an earthquake, or something like a pandemic, whether it's kind of a gradual or whether it's a sudden impact, that we're able to respond to it. And actually here in Oregon, we know there's the Cascadia event that's not a matter of if, but when, that we're talking about. And so making sure we're prepared to do that is all part of this readiness, and be able to prepare in terms of what we do and the resources we have to spend. So thank you. And JR, I wanted to end this conversation with you because you had really been talking about the positive note and how we lean forward into this. So I'm very curious about your magic wand answer, but I really also want to start with an acknowledgement that tribal communities have faced not just natural, but specifically man-made pandemics before, targeted in the past to destroy communities. And yet communities have survived, tribal communities have survived. What are some of the learnings and the wisdom that's taken away from those experiences? If you would be so kind and generous as to share that with us, because now we're in a process where we're facing this natural pandemic, and now we're struggling with how we learn and respond. And so can you share with us?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll mention two things. One, the magic wand answer: honor the treaties. We came a long time ago, we came to agreement on how we're going to exist nation to nation. And, you know, we have sovereign rights. I think that's very important. Is Native Americans, we're not just another community of color. We have a unique political status, and that, you know, we have federal guaranteed rights. So operate in a new lens and moving forward in that way. A lot of the colonial structures that have been built have been built around whiteness and built around male structures. And so we just need to decenter the whiteness to make sure it's on the same level as everyone else, because all humanity can come together and we can work this out together. So definitely a lot of those, we can speak more to that. But the other part I'll mention is that listening to Mother Earth. A lot of our stance on the environment, around nature around us, we need to be taken in some of these lessons. In my tribe, we have a story where lice was a monster that was left for humanity to remind us of how we need to keep clean, how we need to always watch over things, how we need to care for people. It's not, so a lot of our elders are saying this COVID-19 isn't, it's something that needs to be respected and sacred, because it's teaching us some things, and we need to carry those teachings on of how to look after our elders, how to care for those who are less fortunate. And we can't just act that way just during the pandemic, but we need to continue doing that moving forward. As Indigenous communities, you mentioned, we have faced some of these things before. We learned a lot of our resiliency because we listened to Mother Earth. We learn how to take care of our fellow human beings, and doing that in a good way. So I think taking on those lessons from the earth and from our mother and from our grandparents, and sharing them to our next generation, and continuing moving forward together.
Thank you so much for gifting us with that. And I want to thank you all. Thanks to those who have joined us. I know there's other questions, but we're out of time, and so we're not going to be able to get to them. So thanks for everyone who have joined. I want to thank all our guests, all the panelists who joined us. JR, starting with you, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Is there are there any resources you want to share or recommend for folks that we could post? And I'm going to ask this of everyone, and specifically, JR, I'm starting with you because I know you joined us today in your professional capacity and need to sign off early, because I know some folks are going to do kind of a political plug, so I'll have them at the end. Any specific information or resources that you have now and can share, or you can get them to us, we can add to the comment line of this conversation.
Yes, thank you. Just a plug for my day-to-day work. I work for the East Portland Action Plan, advocating for resources to be for East Portland. East Portland is definitely one of the most impacted areas. Go to the eastportlandactionplan.org for more information. We have monthly meetings. Everyone's welcome to join. We're continuing the conversation. So just do that. But anyway, want to say thank you. 2 hands up to the sky to everyone here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Lizzie, I want to turn it over to you. Do you have, thank you for joining us. Thanks for sharing your insights. And is there any information or any resources you want to recommend to folks for addressing some of the things we talked about today?
I do. Anyone that's working in small business, economic development, public policy, I really got to give a shout out to the International Economic Development Council, and I'll post the link in there. They have a whole robust section of toolkits, best practices, examples that other cities around the United States have done after disasters to help their communities rebuild, including inclusion and issues of equity. And I just find them to be one of the best that I work with and draw from.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks again for joining us. Misha, we can put APANO's link in the comment line, but other specific things from APANO's work or any other work that you're doing that you would like to call attention to?
Yeah, so on APANO's website, there are a lot of resources around like COVID response, COVID care, and so on and so forth. So you can see all of that on the website, as well as you could check out our project, Courage During COVID, which is that narrative shift project that I was talking about highlighting the leadership of API women, and also the stories of our community. And like you can get a really good sense of like kind of what's happening in the API Portland APANO's community on that website, and it's like apano.org/courage during COVID. So
excellent, thank you for that. And thanks also, I know APANO is supporting folks running for office, and I'm really honored to have APANO's endorsement. So thanks for all the work you're doing to care for our communities and build a better Oregon, especially in the metro area. Thanks for joining our conversation today. Nik, let me turn it over to you. You've got a big day on Tuesday.
Yeah, big day coming up. Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all, and I'll keep it brief because I know we're out of time. But yeah, if you want to find out more about my policies, I have extensive policies on my website, on my issues page. It's nikforcongress.com, just like it is there on the screen, NIKFOR, congress.com. And my Facebook link is there also. And if you go to my Facebook page, you'll see a private group called People for Nik for Congress. And if you want to get involved in trying to make a difference, if you like the vision that I have on my website and so forth, go ahead and join that group, and we can make it happen. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Nik. And we're co-endorsed, or we're all both endorsed by some organizations as well. So appreciate that. Anthony, let's turn over to you next. You're running for city council. So share some of your information with us, please.
Yeah, running for city council. One, get your ballots in, walk them in. I'm really proud to check the box for you, Jamie, and excited for Tuesday, and Nik also. I would like to plug real quick an organization operating on the Warm Springs Reservation. It's at WSCAT.org. It's the Warm Springs Community Action Team. It's a 501c3 dedicated to helping people build financial independence and supporting small businesses in Warm Springs. So I would like for people to go there. And then obviously I would love for people to support my campaign for Bend City Council. You can find more information about me at broadmanforbend.com. And thanks everybody so much. This has been amazing.
Thanks, Anthony. And then also, actually, to mention, when you mentioned Warm Springs, a good friend of mine, Karina Miller, is running for state senate. Although I think she's unopposed in the primary, but she's a former tribal council member from Warm Springs and a Warm Springs community member. And then also, just for my wife and I, we live nearby, and so our community radio is KWSO. So it's a nice also connection. Melanie, please share contact information for yourself and for your campaign and the organization you're working with.
Sure, yeah. So you can just go to melaniekebler.com. It's Kebler with one E. And that has just some general information about my campaign. You can donate and sign up to volunteer. You can also find me on Twitter at Melanie for Bend. And I like to follow along with some of the online meetings and government meetings that we're doing right now and kind of tweet about those and give information to folks. So I'm pretty active on there as well. And I also have a Facebook page. It's Melanie for Bend City Council. And I do want to plug, as I had mentioned, that I work with domestic violence victims. There's a local nonprofit, Saving Grace, that helps abuse survivors in Central Oregon. It's saving-grace.org, which I think we're going to put it in the chat. And I just want folks to know that they are still operating and they're still helping folks, and they're adapting to these troubling times for survivors, and to reach out or to help a friend reach out if you know someone that needs their help. And thanks so much for having me, Jamie.
Yeah, well, and thanks so much for that important work. It's a lot of the communities, or a lot of the names and faces that aren't seen, and issues of domestic violence have been a major issue during this time, and people staying at home. So lastly, just wrapping it up, my name is Jamie McLeod-Skinner. I'm running to be Oregon's next Secretary of State. Would be honored to have your vote. My website is jamiefororegon.com. My Facebook page is Jamie for Oregon, or Jamie McLeod-Skinner for Oregon. We've got a lot of these roundtables on both Facebook and YouTube, having these conversations of things we need to know about, and conversations we need to be having to really figure out and learn these lessons now so we can build a better Oregon going forward. Thanks everyone for joining me today. Stay safe. Let's have our legacy to COVID-19 be that we got through this together, we learned, and we built a better Oregon. So that's my hope. And then lastly, Tuesday is election day. Your ballot has to be received by 8 p.m. on May 19th for it to count. You can't, in most places, too late to mail it. So find a designated ballot drop box. You can find information on the Secretary of State's website, but get those votes in, because your vote is your voice. So go out there and vote. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.